So I could be saying very much what John and Chris have been talking to you about. So what I'll do is I will try to move on to focus on two things. One is the sort of probability thing that Chris was just talking about, and the other is coalition formation and the probabilities of different governments. But first, method-wise, I'm doing something very similar to what Chris and his team are doing, and using various different things that John was talking about in terms of constituency variation. So I use an average of the polls, but it's my own approach to averaging the polls, quite similar to what Anthony Wells does with UK polling report. I have a process of translating polls now to votes in the future based on the historical experience of polls and votes in the past, respecting the distance from the polls to the actual election result. The modelling assumptions I make there actually produce slightly different conclusions as to what's relevant now at this stage, which I'll move on to talk about. But also, when it comes to looking at seats, I'm similarly using Ashcroft data and data kindly provided by YouGov at the individual level with constituency identifiers. And I'm again modelling that like Chris, but I'm modelling it in a slightly different way, maybe a simpler way, and that leads to slightly different conclusions. And then we both have a probabilistic estimate. So I've been doing this forecasting since autumn of 2013, over a year and a half ago. And you can see in this graph the polls in the light colours and the forecasts in the dark colours. And back in the autumn of 2013, there was a big Labour lead over the Conservatives. But at that stage in the Parliament, using the ideas of sort of swing back and government recovery and opposition setback that John was talking about, you'd expect the Conservatives actually to be fairly well placed to emerge ahead, and that's what the forecast shows, and I've consistently forecast the Conservative lead on votes. Now that Conservative lead on votes forecast has declined over time. The Labour forecast has remained remarkably steady, given that this is quite a crude approach to forecasting over such a long range. It's remained remarkably steady because the Labour polls have declined in much, I'll go back and show you, the Labour polls have declined in much the same way as you'd expect, but the Conservatives since over the last year and a half haven't really made that much of a recovery. They've only just made a small recovery at the end, and so that's why the gap is narrow. Meanwhile, for the Liberal Democrats, they've fallen so much on their 2010 vote that the forecast was presuming that there would be a big upturn for the Liberal Democrats, but as they have failed to recover in the polls, their forecast has also dropped over time. Now, that kind of swing-back mechanism, or if you've gone up, you come down, or if you go down, you go up again, that doesn't look to hold, I think, much in the data for the last 3 weeks of the campaign. Instead, the main reason why I'm now forecasting for the Conservatives to be ahead of Labour in the share of the vote is because of this and what John talked about. The Conservatives have consistently, or not fully consistently, but for most elections have outperformed the polls, and similarly, Labour have very much underperformed the polls on average for most of our elections since the 1950s, and sometimes by quite considerable margins. So for me, I think we need to not assume that bias will just disappear at this election, and assume that actually on average it might be about 1.5 points either way. And once you adjust for that, you get essentially the main reason why my forecast share of vote is different from the actual polling average. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty there. And the error bars, these prediction intervals, essentially the range of outcomes with 95% chance of most likely to happen, have been enormous. They've been narrowing over time, and they've been narrowing as we approach the election, but they're still enormous, I would say. 3 weeks out from the election. And as Chris said, we still can't be sure which of the Conservatives and Labour will emerge ahead. Now, one of the huge virtues of these uncertainty estimates, and they're driven by a mixture of variation in the performance of the polls relative to the actual result, but also variation in the performance of parties during campaigns. John did tell you that this election is different. I agree this election is different, but also so have many of the previous elections been different. You know, the polling gap between the final polls and the actual result has been different in previous elections, and also the trajectories of parties during campaigns have been different. So all of that leads to big uncertainties what will happen over the next 3 weeks, even if we're still in the range of outcomes that you might expect given historical experience. But that historical experience in terms of level of uncertainty also tells us about the range of possible outcomes for different government formation. So you can see the seats prediction there is actually not dissimilar from the election forecast for UK18 for the Conservatives now. Labour I've got a bit lower because I've got the SNP a bit higher on 51. Now that central forecast here at the bottom actually on the graph would appear here on this wonderful pie chart of probabilities of different combinations of parties having majorities. And this is a really complicated situation. And essentially it means Labour, SNP and Liberal Democrats probably need to do some kind of three-way deal, which might be very difficult. And this graph essentially assumes that some government is possible, which isn't actually necessarily the case. Another way to sort of start explaining it is if you start from the top, where you've got both majorities, and work clockwise around, you can see there's an 8% chance of a Conservative majority still. And if they're just short of a majority, then I'm saying that will appeal to the DUP first. If that's not enough to yield a majority, they'll go to the Liberal Democrats. If that's not enough for a majority, they'll go to both parties together. And there it stops for the Conservatives, with 42% chance of Conservatives leading a government. If you go the other way around from the top, you've got a small probability of Labour with a majority, and then they'll go to the DUP, and then they'll go to the Liberal Democrats, and then they'll go to both. And then they might bring in some tiny parties on the left, the SDLP from Northern Ireland, Plaid Cymru, Greens, and that might help. And they'll probably, this graph assumes, avoid dealing with the SNP as much as possible. But then that pink section starts. All these three pink sections are sections in which the SNP are important to sustain a Labour government, i.e. they would deliver a majority from the Labour government. And the third bright pink one is where Labour is still the largest party and Labour and the SNP alone might govern. But these lighter pink ones are in a different colour to emphasise that this is the situation where the Conservatives would be the largest party on votes and seats, but we would have a Labour-led government. And that seems to be the most likely of possible outcomes at the moment. And I'll stop there.
Brilliant, thank you very much.